Mike, first off, huge pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for jumping on and spending a little bit of time with us for this Bitcoin Park Live this afternoon.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks for having me on, Rob. We've had some offline conversations and glad to bring it online.
Yeah, I love this, and I think this is incredibly important. There's something that you mentioned, I think, offhand, and I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak at a couple of different events, and one thing that always blew my mind, and I'd love if we could jump in first with just kind of who you are, what you do, and where you find yourself contributing in the space, and then dive on to kind of the main topic. But I've had the pleasure of hearing you give these brilliant talks that really opened my mind into a world that I don't have huge familiarity with, which is this idea that a lot of people think writing code is just somebody sitting down at their computer or hacking away in a coffee shop and pushing stuff out into the universe, and then everybody goes, it's great. But that's a very naive perspective of what it means to write, develop, and maintain code. And you've mentioned this a couple of times in talks that I've heard you give, and I really would love to explore this. You mentioned one thing in particular at a recent event that we were very, very privileged to have you at, which was that you mentioned this idea of a development iceberg, this idea that we are often in the broad community space talking about the big thing, whatever that big thing is. It could be op return, it could be relay policy, it could be quantum stuff, but at the end of the day, it all devolves into really, really difficult work that's being done by very, very competent developers under what you call under the iceberg. So you only see that little bit on top, but under the iceberg is this massive world of the work. So I'd love to kind of frame our conversation on that today. And if you could start, just introduce us. Who are you and where do you find yourself contributing in the space today?
Yeah, I started as an observer myself, looking at some of this from afar and not really understanding a lot of it. And I decided I wanted to contribute myself. I am not a C++ engineer by trade. I have an engineering and computer science background, found Bitcoin through that and some of the freedom movement. I started contributing when I was at Blockstream. So I was a technical product person at Blockstream and started contributing to the Bitcoin Optech newsletter at that point. I think it was a few episodes in on the newsletter, and have been doing that ever since. Somewhere a year in on that, contributing to Optech, covering a lot of the changes in Bitcoin development. Spun off, John Newberry and I founded Brink. And so that's been just almost 5 years ago now. And Brink is a nonprofit that funds the work that some of these Bitcoin developers are doing on Bitcoin Core specifically. So I have a vantage point both with Optech and with Brink in being able to see the work that these engineers are doing and being in a position to talk about it. But just to be clear, I am not a Bitcoin Core developer.
We won't go into any C++. Could you tell me maybe why does something like Brink have to exist? Like, what was the impetus that made you realize that you needed some kind of entity that could, in a very focused way, fund or help promote development in this space?
Yeah, there's a couple pieces of rationale for that. One is what I tell people all the time, which is Bitcoin is this magic internet money that is based entirely on code. So that's one observation. And the second observation is that all code requires some form of maintenance and upkeep, right? So that is sort of the reason that we need some development in Bitcoin, right? Around like node software, let's say. And then why Brink? Well, we sort of realized, hey, what was traditionally a nights and weekends hobby project for developers to volunteer their time. Maybe they had a full-time job, or maybe they were in a position that they weren't working but they were still volunteering their time. They weren't being paid, right? And at a certain point, it became clear that the Bitcoin asset and network has taken off, but that this pool of engineers working on this are not being compensated according to, let's say, you could use the word adoption. And so it was no longer a nights and weekends hobby project. And so we founded Brink as a conduit for the community to support these engineers so that we can get them full-time if they weren't already full-time, off nights and weekends, and working on this as a career path, because we didn't see that Bitcoin was going to continue to be a developer's night and weekend hobby project any longer. We needed full-time people doing this, compensation, benefits, things like that.
It's a little bit more serious than something that any big pubco who might be materially interested in Bitcoin, they can't just throw 30 grand into something. No, there has to be an entity that says, hey, we're going to do all this hard work of making sure that we actually take care of the code base itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's different organizations. So some of the exchanges have spun up their own grant funding initiatives over the years, although in the last bear market, a lot of those got killed off. And they chose developers and projects individually that they wanted to fund directly. But there's also, given that Bitcoin is this decentralized thing and there's no foundation telling us what to do, so you have exchanges doing that. And you also have organizations like Brink or localhost or Spiral. In the case of Brink and localhost, we're C3 organizations, so we don't have any revenue generation. And so we're here to say, hey, if the community wants to support these engineers, we will route those funds to engineers that we think at Brink are doing the best work on the Bitcoin software. But, there's Spiral, who has affiliation with a profitable company that gets its revenues that way, so they're not charity-based. There's high net worth individuals that have started organizations. And so in true decentralized fashion, like, there is no one way. There's a bunch of people trying to do their best in the way that they see fit.
It's interesting that you bring this up, because I think that and this is not a new conversation in Bitcoin, but it's a recurring conversation, which is this idea that, a particular entity or a particular instance or a particular, whether it's core versus NOTs or BTC, some other variation of running Bitcoin software, they have found themselves in a position where they are kind of ruling the roost. And what you're saying is something really interesting and very powerful, is that we actually need to think about it a lot more like we think about Bitcoin mining, which is this idea that, no, you have all sorts of different interested parties who want to participate and engage with the code base, and all of those entities are empowered to do so.
Yeah, that's right. And early on in Brink, I would always talk to prospective donors or folks who are interested in what's going on with development. And there is and was a bunch of options, right? They could start their own, similar to what like BitMEX had or Gemini had, and they have they can fund directly themselves. That's the highest, I guess, effort and cost for them to do that, but it would be their program. Or they could do something like donate to Brink, where they don't want to have to deal with applications. They don't want to have to deal with any sort of reputational risk by funding the quote unquote, wrong developer or something like this. They don't want to have to do check-ins with that person. And so giving to Brink or OpenSats or localhost is an option for those people. So depending on how deeply you want to be involved, you can spin up your own org, or you can donate to an org already doing it, or anything in between. I guess it goes without saying, this is a voluntary movement, right? The entire Bitcoin movement. And that goes for funding its development as well. I think there are benefits to supporting this work, but I don't in any way think that somebody needs to be doing this, or that it's an obligation of individuals or businesses to do it. It's really up to the engineers and some of us organizations around it to make sure that the awareness is there of the work that is being done, and people can choose to support it voluntarily.
So you mentioned that it's this one particular line that stuck out to me in the presentation that you gave that I'm thinking of, which is this idea of, and you mentioned it as well, this idea of maintenance, right? Code, once it's written, doesn't just exist. It's not like I can buy a lawnmower and just, use it. It's an electric lawnmower, right? Assume it doesn't have a lot of maintenance associated with it. It's not something that I can just kind of buy once and play with for the rest of my life. It is something that requires maintenance, and that's not very sexy, right? What does that look like in reality? What does that look like when we're talking about this iceberg of things that we talk about in development, where this little slice is the stuff that maybe the lay person is exposed to, but the vast majority of what's happening is actually really under the water? What is that work?
Yeah, if you to maybe explain the iceberg analogy, there's this iceberg, and we all see what's sort of at the top, which is the most visible, which is maybe discussions about the Bitcoin protocol itself. So Bitcoin Core implements the Bitcoin protocol, but so does BTCD, and so does LaBitcoin, and other implementations of the Bitcoin protocol have code that supports that protocol. There is no spec for the protocol that's written down, so it lives in software, and people get most involved when there's discussion about changing that protocol, because it's something that needs wide community consensus, to use an overloaded term. And so it gets a lot of discussion. There's not a ton of those changes. And so that's at the very tip of the iceberg. Like, what is Bitcoin? What is this protocol? And then going a level deeper, maybe still above the water of the iceberg there, for the Bitcoin Core project, which is one implementation of the Bitcoin protocol, there's how do these nodes talk to each other on the network, right? If you fire up your Bitcoin node and you don't have any peers, you're not going to get the blockchain, you're not going to get transactions, things like that. So you need some mechanism to communicate with other nodes in this decentralized network. And so there's this peer-to-peer layer, which involves things like policy and mempool that folks may have heard. But because you're talking to other nodes on the network, there is still some visibility, right? Like BTC-D nodes need to know how to send messages to Bitcoin Core nodes, for example. And so that is not the Bitcoin protocol itself, but it's the peer-to-peer protocol, which has, as of recently, a lot of visibility, but normally less visibility than consensus. And so those are two types. This is how I categorize the work. You have consensus work, you have this policy work, and those are sort of above the water, things that people tend to see. And then there's this below the water level work, which is the majority of the iceberg, which is the majority of the work that goes on in the repository in a given year. Is you could classify it as maintenance work, but that's maybe not broad enough. You asked for an example. What kind of maintenance work would there be? Like why can't we just run Satoshi's code? And in some instances, people are running versions of Satoshi's code just more for fun. But one example might be Apple and Mac OS. They changed the way that software can run on their operating systems. Mm-hmm. And it broke Bitcoin to a degree. You couldn't run Bitcoin on Mac. So I think we would all agree that we at least want somebody that can make sure that it runs on the latest operating systems, right? And so you need some engineering work to make sure there's continuity in the software. I don't know if I could run like an Oregon Trail floppy disk from like the early 90s, for example. So there needs to be the code needs to run on modern operating systems and modern hardware. So you need people to do that sort of work. There's also, to continue the Satoshi question, Satoshi's code wasn't perfect, and it's not just the code that people may think some of the minutia could be improved, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with BIP42. Do you know BIP42?
Not offhand.
So Satoshi had a bug in the code that governed how many Bitcoins there were going to be ever. And actually,
this was the output inflation bug?
No, it wasn't that. Essentially, and I don't remember the exact timelines, but you sort of have the distribution that everybody's familiar with. You get to 21 million. Well, eventually, one of the counters would sort of reset, and then you'd get 50 Bitcoin block rewards again for a period of time.
Oh, funny.
And you get another 21 million, and it would essentially uncapped, right? And so the thing that was most sacred to a lot of people in Bitcoin is the supply cap. And for years, it wasn't known that there actually wasn't a supply cap. There was a bug even in that code, right? So you can imagine when we're talking about data stores and peer-to-peer networking code and operating systems and things like that there's been plenty of bugs fixed over the years, and there's probably plenty that remain, hopefully none severe, but it's engineers' job to find those if they do exist, right? So there's a few examples of things that I think are under that waterline visibility that I think are important. We can dig into any of those if you think are interesting.
Well, when I think about you mentioned kind of running different implementations of the protocol, how you distinguish that it's still the protocol. You're still running Bitcoin if you're running Satoshi's version of Bitcoin, or if you are running the most up-to-date modern version of any of the potential, Bitcoin deployments that you could run. Can you help us understand, outside of kind of bugs? So bugs are, we want to squash them. We want to get rid of them. We want to ensure the fidelity of Bitcoin as a functional protocol. These things still remain interoperable with each other. So how different can they be from each other? We've all heard of kind of the big modern conversation about, what is your data carrier limit, or what can you do in terms of mempools? And that doesn't break the ability for one implementation of Bitcoin to work with another implementation of Bitcoin. How different can they be? How different can they be from each other?
Yeah, there's some. So I guess everything can go back to some Greg Maxwell post, but there's some historical Greg Maxwell post that really gets, I guess, to the highest degree of paranoia in terms of, if you're not running it in C++, yada yada, you may fall out of consensus in these theoretical scenarios, right? And so that's why a lot of people lean on Bitcoin Core, who has the majority of implementation, as like, if there is a bug in there, like, that's essentially what consensus is then, right? Because we can't have the protocol specified somewhere, at least not to my knowledge, that you can programmatically say like, oh, this is the protocol, so check your node implementation against this spec. A lot of people have used, Bitcoin Core's consensus engine as that spec, right? And there's been efforts in the past to modularize that piece of consensus, and there's a new version of that called Bitcoin kernel, in which Bitcoin Core engineers are trying to sort of cut around, like, what is this piece? What is this kernel that is Bitcoin, right? And sort of isolate that out. And there's lots of reasons to do that, but in theory, one advantage of that is that people could layer on top their own other pieces, other GUIs or other, peer-to-peer preferences or whatnot. And so that project's actually gotten a lot of legs in the last couple of years, and so it should be interesting to see if there's uptake on that from alternate node implementations.
Do you think there's been this conversation that's come up, and it's always through the disagreements that people have to then go back and explain what they were doing for the last 7 years and kind of make it human readable. So as unfortunate and painful as these situations always are, the silver lining to me is always that people who really care inevitably become smarter about how this thing works. What are your thoughts around, is there a risk associated with too many people running the same implementation? Do you think that there's maybe some philosophical argument to be had that the kernel is the thing that we should be focusing on? You've seen the protocol go from being a nights and weekends thing to being a very serious multi-trillion-dollar asset with many $100 billion companies, or hundreds of billions of dollars of companies worth of entrepreneurial innovation that are directly connected to this thing. Does it matter if there's more than one implementation? Should there not be one implementation? Is it the more the merrier? What are your thoughts about this? And of course, given that you're focused on one, you have the one that you're dedicated to, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you think there should only be one. I've never heard anybody argue that there should only be one. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that we have the option from a software perspective to software fork, right? Not soft fork, not change the protocol, but have a copy of the code, right? That's part of the reason why open source is so important in Bitcoin. Yeah, of course, you want your digital magic internet money to be open source so that you know how it works, so you can validate that it's doing what it's saying it's going to do. But another reason is you can take a copy of that, right? If kernel becomes a thing, and a lot of people are using kernel for consensus, for example, I don't see that necessarily as a risk unless it were some closed source piece of software, which would then mean that the team who can touch that would be a centralizing force and potentially a trusted force in Bitcoin, right? And so I think that's the important piece, is that it's open source and that it could be taken and put into a different piece of node software or something totally different that isn't even maybe a full node. Maybe it's doing just research and analytics, for example, right? That the open source component, I think, is the key there. And I think we're sort of seeing a version of that with what's happening with knots in Bitcoin Core now, right? We may disagree about the rationale, but the pieces are in place that if people want, you can go and have an alternate node implementation, right? And so we've gone through the exercise here in the last month or so. And so I think it's good to always have that option, even if people are exercising it in ways that I don't think are necessarily like a good reason now. It's good that we did it to prove that it works, right? We kind of always talk about it. It's great that it's open source. You could always fork it. And of course, Knots has been around a while, but you sort of see it playing out in real time.
Yeah, the good thing about an anti-fragile system is that if something hurts, that usually means it's making things better. As you think about, particularly what you're doing with Brink, with these ideas in mind, how do you establish a vision for Brink? How do you really orient yourself as an organization? Because you want to be good stewards of the chain. You want to be good stewards of the protocol. But how do you kind of shoulder that responsibility and ensure that you're doing it in a way that is aligned with the values of, not just the organization and not just the people who want to support the organization, but also with the responsibility to be good stewards of the protocol in some sense, knowing that you don't have to have the answer to everything, right? Brink is not deciding what happens to quote unquote Bitcoin, the grand Bitcoin. But you, as somebody who's heading up an organization that's doing some fantastic work, how do you think about that, particularly in your role?
Yeah, I think there's a few pieces to set the context. One, there's probably 40 or 50 of these engineers that are maybe full-time working on the Bitcoin Core software. Brink is funding 8 of those engineers currently. And in the Bitcoin Core development space, we've really focused on security and maintenance kind of work, right? And so in order to evaluate, how we're doing, I want to make sure to tell people that that's our focus, right? So evaluate against that. So we have people doing, fuzz testing initiatives, some of the security disclosures, those sorts of things, as well as a couple of the maintainers are funded by Brink. And so that's the context. And then in terms of ensuring to the broader Bitcoin community that we're doing the work that sort of work that we said that we were going to be doing, there's a few pieces that help with that. One is it's great. Again, this is all open source, right? So you can see the GitHub handles of people who are Brink funded. You can see the reviews that they're leaving. You can see the code reviews. You can see the PRs being opened. You can see them on the mailing list. You can see them in the IRC chats. So a lot of the artifacts are public. Now, in some cases, those artifacts are dispersed and highly technical and might need some summary. So actually, last year was the first year that Brink put out an annual report, which is somewhere in between looking at the code and maybe seeing a presentation or something like that. So, it was, I want to say, like a 25-page report. Most of it focused on the engineers in their work, and not just, hey, this pull request got merged, but tying it together. This is why it's important that this pull request and the associated ones are merged, because it facilitates XYZ in Bitcoin, right? So now you have these open artifacts of the code and the discussions and the mailing list. You have a summary of it that we put out each year. We're going to do it again mid-year this year. And so we hope that provides transparency. Along with that report is non-engineering content as well. So things about Brink, like how much money did we raise? Where did the money come from? These sorts of things. And so we hope that instills confidence in the community. And then finally, this organization structure is such that we have independent board members that are essentially my bosses, right? So they can see what's going on, that we've had turnover there, which is good. We have different eyes coming in, observing what's going on, opining from a totally independent, uncompensated perspective. And then similar, we have a grant committee that looks at the applications of new engineers as well as engineers that are already funded by Brink, and evaluates their contributions to Bitcoin to decide if we're going to bring somebody new on, for example.
So is it fair to kind of think of Brink not as an entity that determines things, but more like you're curating a forum where the conversations happen? You're essentially matching interested parties who might not have the time or the technical competence to be able to really go below the iceberg, and they know that you need to go below the iceberg when you're going to do things like keep your code implementation up to date so that the next Mac launch doesn't brick everybody's implementation of their node. You're matching those folks and communicating with them while creating a space that the conversation happens. You're not kind of speaking as a singular voice or entity.
Yeah, that's right. We've actually made very deliberate efforts to find engineers who are doing good work and then pay them to do that good work. So we are not dictating to them, hey, that was really great what you were working on last year, but this year you're going to do XYZ, right? So that they maintain their autonomy from an engineering perspective when they join Brink. We will facilitate conversations, we'll get them to conferences or trainings or connect them with people who could help based on the work that they're already doing, but we're not guiding that work per se. I think that's important, and that's also something that the grant committee is looking at and highly values is the autonomy of these folks. And then there's separation from the donors and the engineers. Sure, they run into each other at conferences and things like that, and so of course they speak, but this is not a donor funding an individual or a donor funding a project. This is a donor funding our mission, which, as I outlined, is securing Bitcoin. Let's not let Bitcoin break, right? Is the mission. And so if donors want to fund that mission, they can. and then we are the ones who are responsible for routing those funds to the engineer. So there's a degree of separation. It's even more unlikely that a donor could apply pressure to the engineers who will actually be authoring the code.
You mentioned some of the unsexy work that's happening, the fuzz testing, which I don't think everybody knows what that is, but I would love to give you some space to kind of give a breakdown of what it is, talking about the ability to integrate with other systems in the worldwide connected universe to make sure these things don't break. What are some examples of things that we may not even, I'm thinking almost like, the president doesn't get any credit, or the guy in the three-letter agency who averts a nuclear war and then figures out a way to avoid it. He's not going to get any credit. You're not going to get any credit if you figure out, crap, something's going to happen that could potentially cause great harm to Bitcoin, and we fixed it and we're able to, responsibly disclose, but make sure we had a patch for it. Can you share some examples of cases where that has occurred, where through this kind of unsexy but very difficult and very important work, you've found things like this that we might not be celebrating enough?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you touched on like one of the mechanisms to find these sorts of things, which is fuzz testing. So you can kind of think of fuzz testing as sort of mining for bugs a little bit. You can take, there's all these pieces of the code that make up any piece of software, but we'll use Bitcoin Core because that's what we're focused on. There's all these different functions, right? Well, if you can isolate some of these functions, you can make the code a little bit more modular in the sense that you can then start testing one little piece of that code. And essentially what you can do with fuzz testing is you can structure quasi-random inputs to that function. So you can say, hey, this looks something like a transaction, but make up a bunch of stuff and just keep grinding away at it, putting quasi-random things in there for days, weeks, and see if that code crashes or hits a certain edge case or something strange happens that hasn't happened before when we've run that code, and log that. And then some human will look at that output and see if that was like some sort of a false positive or if there was actually an error there. And so one of our engineers, Nicholas, has really carried the torch on this fuzz testing effort, building out fuzz testing infrastructure to do everything that I outlined at a larger scale. And it was about a year ago that this was, maybe 9 months ago that this was disclosed, but it was a couple years ago that it happened. He found that in the peer-to-peer level, you could send a couple malformed, or maybe not malformed, but a couple messages to your peer structured in a specific way, and it would crash the node. So you can imagine somebody who's got a list of all the nodes on the network and just writes a loop and sends these malformed messages to all the nodes on the network and crashes the Bitcoin network, or largely crashes the Bitcoin network, which probably includes a lot of exchanges and miners and things like that. Now you can imagine if that got into the wrong hands, right? A nefarious actor could sell that exploit on the black market. Somebody could execute that exploit and short Bitcoin at the same time and try to make millions or billions of dollars, because surely the price is going to go down if the Bitcoin network is largely down. And Nicholas found that quietly. He came up with the fix, put it in. Anybody who's running, I forgot which version, but one of the last few versions of Bitcoin Core has that fix in there, and probably doesn't even know it, right? Everybody knows, Saylor's got his maxi, double maxi, triple maxi things that he presents, and I'm sure a lot of people know what those are, but probably nobody knows that bug was there and was fixed quietly by Nicholas, even though it was publicly disclosed on the bitcoincore.org website.
I love that. And it's hearing you walk through this is really occurring to me that this is simply just a formalization of what people have been doing in Bitcoin since the beginning of Bitcoin. You can go back into a couple of examples come to mind. One was the maybe not so recent example of the Lightning Network, where somebody created that 998 of 999 multisig and then crashed one of the Lightning Network deployments. They were kind of tinkering, trying to figure out, hey, like what works, what doesn't work. Like that's in a sense kind of fuzz tech testing, but doing it in production. And you can go back way further into just the early days of people running the code, 2009 to 2012. there's all sorts of crazy transactions that are just people goofing off with stuff. There's all sorts of, I found one very, very early one just prior to Luke very famously putting text into SIG script, and this was kind of what preceded. It's the same mechanism that people use if you're going to put, certain information as a miner when you find a block into that block header that something like a mempool.space would use to know basically who found a block. Well, they know because they're putting it in this SIG script section of the Coinbase transaction. If you look at, and somebody made a Git repo where they tried to kind of crawl, they were looking for every like op return, NFT, any sort of like info data that was in Bitcoin. Somebody threw a transaction in a SIG script. And it was very early in Bitcoin, and I still haven't figured out who's done it. So if you know who's done it, please let me know. This was a couple of months before Luke started putting text into the SIG script. But it occurred to me, somebody was probably just screwing around with the software, because inside the SIG script is a transaction ID with reference to a transaction that was mined in that block. And you think, well, what's the reason for this? Well, there's a very easy reason. Somebody was screwing around with the protocol. They were trying to learn it. They were trying to break it. They were trying to figure out how it worked under the hood, and they threw it in there to see what the heck would happen. It's crazy to me how what you're describing is basically just the formalization of what has always been happening in Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I want to take an opportunity. I know I was saying Nights and Weekends project, and we're trying to grow with the ecosystem and the development side, and it's no longer Nights and Weekends hobby project. But kudos to that group, right? I mean, they got us a decade and a half, through this thing. In many cases, it was Nights and Weekends. So I think there was a lot of great work done there. I don't mean to diminish that, other than we want to take that,
of course,
and get more of that, right? Get more rigor around that, right? Be able to, in the example that I gave of Nicholas and fuzzing, get him to the fuzz testing experts in Canada at a conference and really level up his knowledge, and get to the point where we as Bitcoiners are actually sharing security knowledge with other industries, because in a lot of instances, reproducible builds, things like this, Bitcoin is sort of at the leading edge of some of these pieces, just due to the nature of the project. And so it wouldn't be possible without a lot of the tinkerers that got us here in the early days.
Mike, this is immense. First off, thank you. We're coming to the end of our time, but thank you so much for joining us. And it's really a pleasure to have you on, to be able to dive into something that I think folks really need more exposure on, which is, if you run a node, it is not so simple to say, I am Bitcoin in this kind of I am Spartacus way and just kind of walk away and live the rest of your life. There's all this stuff happening underneath the iceberg, underneath the waterline, that is really valuable and speaks to the contributions that the outside world makes to Bitcoin, but also our contributions to the outside world. Can you kind of take us home and let us know where to find you, let us know how to support you, let us know where to learn more about you and kind of keep up with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, if you're curious about the work that we're doing specifically at Brink, you can go to brink.dev, brink.dev, and you can see the engineers that we fund there. We have a blog that covers some of the technical pieces that I've talked about. We have a monthly engineering call that is often recorded, sometimes with outside guests on interesting technical topics that the engineers ask questions for. So that's a great place for that. If you're looking for a bigger picture, including other organizations, what's happening in Lightning, what's happening with DLCs, what's happening on the mailing list, I would highly recommend Bitcoin Optech, which is a weekly newsletter. We do a weekly podcast. It's all free. It covers things that you probably don't want to look into yourself every week, which is the Bitcoin Core IRC meeting, the Bitcoin Dev mailing list, what changes happened in the Core Lightning repository this week, what were some interesting questions from the Stack Exchange about Bitcoin. So we sort of aggregate that all into the newsletter each week and summarize it in a way that is a little bit more layperson accessible, and also saves people a bunch of time. So that's Bitcoin Optech, bitcoinops.org. And so that would be another place I'd point people to who are curious about the technicals.
Mike, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.